Hi, you're watching Frank Conversations. I'm your host, Frank Scarcello, at Thunder Bay Live, and here I am today with my guest, Doug Burry. Doug,
Hey Frank, how are
Doug
you?
is good. Doug is the Chief Executive Officer of the Community Economic Development Corporation of Thunder Bay, which is, of course, a division of the city, an important division tasked with economic development in our city. And I came to a presentation a couple of weeks ago, Doug, regarding the KPMG study or analysis that was done in terms of looking at how competitive Thunder Bay is in terms of business location and other things. So tell me about that study, tell me about the results, and what do you think?
Frank, as you know, we put together our strat plan in 2000 and released it in the fall of 2014. It's valid from 2014 to 2017. We figured 3 years, the world changes a lot in 3 years, so start talking any longer than that. And so one of the things that was identified in there is what's the strengths and weakness, opportunities and threats for Thunder Bay. And how do we go about doing that? Well, then I came across that KPMG does on a biannual basis a study on the competitiveness of cities from around the world. And so the 2014 one had been completed, but I talked to KPMG and they said that we could buy our way in so that they would come and look at our data. And I looked and see who else was in the study, and Sudbury was the only one that was in the study from Northern Ontario. So I talked to the other communities in Northern Ontario, Sault Ste. Marie, Timmins and North Bay, and they all thought they'd like to join too. So we went in as a group of 4 into that. And then we then had a comparison of us versus the other. Sudbury was in already, so we had 4 other, similar climate, similar locations, right? And so we had an opportunity to see that. And then we also had the opportunity to look at other cities in Ontario, in our region in Manitoba, Minnesota, Michigan, over to Quebec. And so what happens when you get into this is that basically you end up with as a key into a server with a database, and you have all kinds of numbers for all the different industries, so whether it's, as you know, the service sector industries or manufacturing. And so now you have to put your numbers together and say, well, what do you want to look for? It's just like if I give you a whole bunch of numbers and go back to when you were going to school, how are you going to chart them? What are you looking for, right? And that's what we wanted to do. So we looked at, from a service industry point of view, where did we fall out with respect to the input costs. And this study too, when you look at a business moving to a community, there's input costs, then there's labor availability, what's the community like, then there's infrastructure, and then there's the soft costs. So there's 4 categories. Well, when you're thinking of doing a comparison around the world, not everybody measures everything the same way, but they do measure input costs the same way. So what are the transportation costs, what are the taxes, what's the utility cost, what's the labor cost, what's the facility to have a building. Those are things that you can measure, right? The dollars per square foot or land or whatever. So that's what was concentrated on in that study, and that's what you could what we wanted to get to, and then run those comparisons to see where did Thunder Bay end up doing that. So that's what we did. We went back and we looked at that, and out of that came what are our strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats. So as we look at that, on the strength side, we had some opportunities, some strengths around facilities and facility costs. Now, this study was done strictly on coming into town and leasing a building. This study was not done on coming into town, finding a plot of land, building a building, going through all the development and everything else like that. So from a facility lease point of view, we were in pretty good shape because we do have some available buildings, and our cost is not comparable to Toronto, right? We're cheaper.
Absolutely.
Labor costs, we were in the middle of the pack, so we weren't negative, we weren't positive, which is a good spot to be in, right? Natural gas costs, we were actually very good at that. And so, when you look at what industries should we be looking at going forward, people that use, consume natural gas would be a good one, right? I mean, in this study, the manufacturing sectors in this study are not big natural gas users, okay? So it shows up that it's a strength for us, but relatively speaking, it's not a huge number. Electricity, well, in this study again, electricity was not a big consumer. We didn't have steel mills, pulp and paper mills, or whatever in this study, okay? So electricity, we were okay in compared to some of the other Ontario cities. We were better than most of the other Ontario cities I found that interesting because I thought, why would we be better? But as it turns out, back in, I don't have my dates perfectly correctly, but in 1999, 2000 or something like that, Thunder Bay Hydro and the City Council put in a rate structure that the power bills in Thunder Bay from the local distribution company, which is Thunder Bay Hydro, there's no profit taken from it. So the City of Thunder Bay owns Thunder Bay Hydro, but there's no profit taken from it. So it's whatever it costs to pass the power through to you from the grid. That's what it is. Whereas other locations, they actually take a profit. So that's an advantage for
So
us.
for smaller users,
We're
very competitive.
we're competitive. Now, let's be careful here now, because when we cross over that border
Then it gets-
and we go into Manitoba, then we know that it's cheaper over there, right? And we go into Quebec, we know it's cheaper there. Minnesota is, is similar to us, but so when we compare just Ontario, not so bad, So, it's all relative to, you're as
Exactly.
good as your next door neighbor and how far away is your next door neighbor,
Exactly.
right? So then, like I said, the number one issue for us that showed up in spades was, from a cost point of view, was transportation. And then followed by a lot less of a number is property taxes.
Okay.
And so when you look at, what are the comparisons between the two, depending on the manufacturing industry, transportation can be anywhere from 7-8% all the way up to 33% of an input cost. Okay, that's a big number,
Big chunk.
right? Labor obviously usually being the biggest of them all.
Yeah.
Whereas property taxes could be 1 or 2%.
Yeah.
Right?
Instead of
So we have to put it in perspective from the point of view is if you're high over here,
Yeah.
not such a great spot to be,
Yeah.
but 1 or 2% versus being high on a 33%, that's a game changer.
Yeah.
You're not going there, right?
And we should just clarify, not property taxes for, it's business taxes, industrial,
Yeah.
our business,
Industrial, commercial,
commercial
yeah,
taxes.
not residential. Residential doesn't enter
Yeah.
into this, right? And and so when people say, well, where do the numbers come from? Well, KPMG and the company they hired to do it, I didn't put one number into
Yeah.
the equation. They go onto the different cities' websites and they get all that
They collect it.
rates and everything else off that. And they have a standard thing that says, here's the size of the factory.
Yeah.
Is it 50,000 square feet?
Yeah.
Is it 60,000 or whatever, right?
And it's kind of sort of surprising because when we look at Thunder Bay, we think of Thunder Bay as a transportation hub. As we have a port. Not everyone has a port. We have the CNCP. We have our international airport. So it's surprising, but I think what you guys found out, there's a specific area.
Yeah. So when this study, again, when you look at it, it's the one that we chose to look at to analyze because it had a comparison of that. But it requires that when you manufacture something, you have to ship your product back out to the world.
Sure.
Not just down to Minneapolis or Chicago. You got to ship it to the world.
Right.
So we're in the middle of the continent,
Yeah.
And so how do you get it to the world? So if I had to ship it, and they have it by industry, so whether you're making aircraft parts or automobile parts or
Widgets,
whatever widgets or whatever you're making, there's a certain percentage that has to go to the United States, to certain selected cities, some that has to go to Canada, some to South America, Africa, Europe, and the Far East. So trucking, if we had to ship to Dallas or St. Louis, we do very well against other cities in Ontario.
Sure.
Because we can get
Get on the highway.
we can get on the highway and go from Thunder Bay to Minneapolis or over to Denver, cheaper than the guy in Toronto can get from Minneapolis to Denver, right?
Okay.
So we did okay on that. Stuff that had to move by train, like if it was in a boxcar, we were okay with that.
Sure.
I mean, obviously we had to go back to Halifax. That was more expensive than the guy in Toronto, right?
Okay.
But where we started to get into some difficulties was stuff that has to go overseas either goes over air freight or it goes over container. And so and container being the bulk of it, not everything flies air freight. But let's just, for a minute talk about air freight.
You just drive with a container, those big things.
So the containers are, that's where the products move around the world now, either in 20-foot containers or 40-foot containers, right?
Okay.
So when you're sitting at the railway crossing here in Thunder Bay, on the CPR main line, you'll see those container trains going by. They could contain 400 or 500 containers, right? There could be like 150, they call them well cars, where there's one container and then another one stacked on them. That will come through Thunder Bay. Depending on where the economy is and how things are going, there could be anywhere from 30 to 40 container trains a day going through Thunder Bay. Some going east, some going west, right? And on those containers, you'll see, Costco, which is the
Canadian Tire. I see.
or Canadian Tire.
Yeah.
Costco's China's overseas shipping company, right?
Okay.
Or you see Hagen, or you see Maersk, or you
Right.
see Canadian Tire.
Yeah.
The Canadian Tire ones are a little different. Those are 53-foot containers. And so what happens with Canadian Tire in Vancouver is the ship comes in from the Far East, wherever it comes from, Korea, Japan, China, or whatever they're getting their material from. It comes into Vancouver and it's cross-docked so that the containers come off, and Canadian Tire has a big distribution center in Vancouver.
Okay.
And it's put into those 53-foot Canadian Tire-owned containers.
Right, right.
And then they go east. And then they go in either to Calgary or Winnipeg or Toronto or Montreal.
Uh-huh.
And then they either get dispersed into the distribution center or turned around with wheels on it and gets
trucks.
delivered to a store, right?
Okay.
So the issue for Thunder Bay with containers is up until around 2004, 2005, we did have a container system here. Canadian Pacific did have container trains stop. We did have the container yard, we have the equipment, and we were able to pull off containers.
Uh-huh.
Then Canadian Pacific changed its model, and also the industry changed at Thunder Bay.
Uh-huh.
You know, up until 2004, we had, a number of paper machines,
Yeah.
craft mills. So we had things that were shipping out in containers too, right? That all
So
started.
the volume was there.
The
Now.
volume changed, and the model changed that Canadian Pacific is running, right?
Okay.
So now they won't stop the train in Thunder Bay. The train stops maybe for diesel by the airport, where they
Okay.
load it up with a portable truck, and then it carries on its way down to Toronto.
So the infrastructure or the machines or whatever was
Still
used,
here.
They're still here.
The port owns it.
The port owns all that stuff. So
That's
it's not
right.
like rusting away or
No,
anything.
so it's got a nice little garage that the port has, and it's in there. And the rail yard is still there. It's part of the port lands now,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
So all that's there. So it just becomes a back to then how do we solve that problem, right? And so a couple of things on how you potentially solve that problem and why we need to solve that
Sure.
problem. Okay. First is, containers aren't going to go away.
No.
That's how people are going to move stuff from the Far East to Canada or North America.
Yeah.
I mean, you just got to go. Last summer, I happened to be in Prince Rupert. Prince Rupert is a container terminal port now, and you get one of those ships pulls in, 15, 20,000 containers on it. They're just unloading it. That's like 25 trains to get that
Yeah,
ship in,
yeah.
right? All coming down, going to Memphis and Chicago on
Mhm.
Canadian National. But all those goods are coming in from everywhere in the world in a container.
Right.
So now, let's fast forward the clock a little bit and say Canada has negotiated a free trade agreement with the European Free Trade,
Mm-hmm.
the European Union.
Mm-hmm.
Not ratified yet. We're still
Mhm.
waiting on that
Mhm.
that goose to cook. But
Mhm.
so there's a free trade agreement that we're going to have with Europe. Can't tell you when. Is it 6 months from now? Is it a year from now? Is it next month? And suppose now we want to attract a business from Europe that doesn't have a presence in North America,
Mhm.
that would like to make widgets.
Mhm.
There's our term, right?
Yeah.
Make widgets to feed the Midwest. Why wouldn't you want them to set up in Thunder Bay, right?
Right.
And so let's say, like all good things in the world now, everybody has interchangeable parts. So, like the chances of something being made 100% in Thunder Bay, chances are parts are going to come from all over the world to be
Mhm.
assembled in Thunder Bay
Mhm.
to then be sold into the United States,
Mhm.
right? Well, that's got to come here by container. So the federal government is going to sign a free trade agreement that's going to benefit Canada, but benefit who in Canada?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
People that have access to containers, right?
Exactly.
The Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, which is, the new government
Another
signed it in
deal.
New Zealand.
Yeah.
It's going to go to a free vote to decide if we're in or we're out.
Yeah.
That's going to be with 40-something countries in the Far East. Those parts are going to come how, right?
Yeah,
They're going to
container.
come to Thunder Bay. Well, will they come to Thunder Bay? They need to come in a container, right?
So-
So my challenge now is, the government of Canada says we need the free trade agreements
Mhm.
to get into, all this trade and manufacturing. While there's only selected cities in Canada that have container systems that are there, right? So what are we going to do about that, right?
So Doug, what can the city do? Do we have to obviously lobby the government?
So lobby the government, we will.
Do we have to convince Canadian Pacific and CN? I guess if they see as well, is that, obviously.
Well, so part of it is it's a chicken and egg thing. Bring the volume, we'll bring the containers. You don't bring the volume, you don't get the containers. If you don't have containers, why do I need volume, right?
Yeah,
Right?
right.
So if you're trying to attract someone to come to Thunder Bay, I think there's an intermediate step there.
Okay.
Yeah, I look at, here's what we've been doing in other parts of the province to deal with the economy and infrastructure, okay? So in Toronto, there's obviously been a population boom in Toronto, right? Lots of people coming to Toronto. You've been in Toronto, I've been in Toronto. Little gritty luck, you know, when it comes to traveling. So getting people into Toronto is a problem. Getting workers into Toronto is a problem.
Right.
It's our financial capital. You got to have people that can come into Toronto, right? So what's the province doing? What's the federal government doing? They're spending billions on mass transit to move people into Toronto. Well, people are an input. They are labor to go to work, right?
Exactly.
So we've identified that as a concern. People, the good burghers of Toronto identified that as a concern that we have to fix the input of getting people into Toronto. And the province and the feds are responding to that,
And
right?
it seems like the feds have been sold.
The feds have been sold on that. Look at the 401 or the 400 series highways. People are growing. I mean, I went to school at the University of Waterloo. The 401 was 4 lanes. It's a lot bigger than 4 lanes between Kitchener, Waterloo, and Toronto now, right? That as people grew and as the industries grew, the government's invested in the infrastructure. We got another example. The bridge between Windsor and Detroit. The old bridge, the Ambassador Bridge, was too slow. Big traffic jams to get across. Industry says you're tying us up. You know, it takes 4 or 5 hours to get across that bridge, right?
Time is money.
Time is money. What's the federal government doing? We're building a new bridge. We're even building the customs for the U.S. government.
Oh, wow.
Right? So we're building the infrastructure to solve the call it the gridlock in Southern Ontario.
Yeah.
So I'm saying is we should be able to look at I call Thunder Bay small town from the point of view that it's not a mega city like the 4th largest city in North America, which is Toronto, right? So whether that's Thunder Bay or some of the smaller prairie cities or some of the smaller cities, Sudbury doesn't have containers, Sault Ste. Marie doesn't have containers. You can get a container there, but it got to come on wheels, right? Comes up in the cost. So ask a business in Thunder Bay, and here's a perfect person to go see. Go look at somebody that has granite countertops. Okay? The chances are some of the granite comes from Italy. Okay? Ask the guy to tell you how much it costs to get the container from Italy to Thunder Bay, right?
He has. Yeah, it's very expensive.
It's very expensive.
Yeah.
It's a fraction of the cost to get it from Italy to Montreal. Then it's like 2 times or 3 times the cost to get it from Montreal to Thunder Bay because you're fiddling with this damn container, right? So, I think there's an opportunity to solve that. So the province of Ontario is doing a multimodal study, for Northern Ontario. It's part of this whole thing about how are our roads, how's the infrastructure if we get more mining, how's the airport. The lady that's heading it up's got a big task. What I presented our analysis of that saying containers is an issue. Containers are an issue for all the Northern Ontario cities. And so we need to put that on the radar, right? We need to get that to the province's attention. And so how do you solve that? Well, maybe in the short term, we can move a boxcar from Thunder Bay to Toronto. It doesn't go on the container train, but it gets there. So in the east, the Ontario government owns a railroad. It's called the Ontario Northland. It runs from North Bay to Hearst up to Moosonee. They have a fleet of cars.
Who owns it? The government does?
Yeah, the government of Ontario does.
Oh, okay.
So I'm not saying this is the answer. It is a possible answer. So what would happen if now the Ontario Northland leases some well cars and some containers that we could use in Thunder Bay, or at least the well cars, that we could have go down to Montreal and pick up product and come back. Now, it's not as simple as I make it sound, but there's solutions to things, right? There's always solutions to things. There's just the political will to make things happen, right? So that's what we have to start, looking at from the point of view is what's, recognize there's a problem, recognize we're signing free trade agreements with people around the world, recognize that the products get here in 20 and 40 foot containers. So how do we participate? Or do we all pack our bags and move to Toronto? Or Montreal, right? The government doesn't want that to happen, right? So that's part of our issues, recognizing that there's something that needs to be worked on.
Excellent. Well, it's a tough task, and I'm happy to hear that you're on it. You understand the issue very, very well, and that's now you just have to
the trick is
pound away at it.
And that's where we'll get the intergovernmental affairs of City Council, and we got 2 ministers here, and we now have a federal minister here. I've had a meeting with the federal MP and the federal minister and said, transportation is a minister for us. And that's just making people aware of it first.
And these politicians, they're inundated with all kinds of information.
They are.
you know, when they come and see you, they hear about containers. They come and see other people, they hear about all kinds of issues. So I think it's, you know, just got to keep pounding away.
And you know, in the case with talking with our federal politicians is that, you know, lots of conversations happen in Ottawa, right? There's lots of committees. I'm not sure all the committees that they may or may not sit at.
Yeah.
Certain discussions will occur, especially with respect to, you know, the ratification of the European Free Trade Agreement.
Yeah.
And for sure, whether we ratify or don't ratify at a free vote or whatever it's going to happen in the House of Commons with respect to the TPP, right?
Yeah.
But these are all issues that if we go down that path, what are we going to do for, as I say, small town Canada, right?
So
how do they participate?
Yeah. Now, the second thing, it was not a show, it was not I think you referred to it as not a showstopper or something like that. It was taxes.
Yeah.
So taxes, the high level of taxes is also a problem, an issue.
So as we said that yes, and we've identified that to City Council. I mean, you've even seen Frank Pouliot write a letter to the editor a couple of weeks back,
Yeah.
right, where he talked about commercial and industrial taxes being on the high end. So that's been identified. Again, you know, that's something that if I had my magical wand, I'd say, can we get somewhere else other than where we're at, you know, to a lower number? Again, when you look at it though, I mean, there's a lot of demands on the city of Thunder Bay to help support this, help do that, right? But I also look at it and say, and put it in perspective. Taxes represent 1 or 2% of a business's, manufacturing business's cost, right? So let's get out of where we're at and get to a spot in the middle of the pack, right?
Yeah.
But let's also recognize is that, you know, if I waved my magical wand tomorrow and said the tax problem goes away, well, I have hundreds of companies show up here. No. But I also don't want to look at it from the point of view is that when people look at Thunder Bay, we're not just on a single list that has Thunder Bay on its name, right? There's a list, let's make a hypothetical company from Europe that's interested in coming to set up in North America. Thunder Bay may show up on a list of 10. Now, a site locator's job is to eliminate cities, right? Because a company coming from Europe doesn't necessarily want to go see 10 cities. They want a short list.
Yeah.
So we may get on the long list, but now we got to get on the short list, right?
On the short list.
So then when you look for reasons to take people off the list, right? And that's what we don't want to be, is in a spot where we have a reason to take ourselves off the list, right? So, you know, at the end of the day, and you could say the same thing about if the product that you're going to make, where's Thunder Bay when you look at it from a strength? If the product you're going to make in Thunder Bay doesn't require a whole bunch of parts coming from around the world, but it can be manufactured in Thunder Bay and sold in the Midwest, would you rather set up in Toronto with their rates or set up in Thunder Bay? Well, you want to do that in Thunder Bay.
Exactly.
So we just can't say that all conditions in KPMG drive, then therefore we're, you know, this, that, and the other thing.
Exactly.
No, it just gives us an example that, you know, containers and air freight that has to go. And we didn't talk briefly, but air freight is still an issue too, from the point of view is that if it has to go air freight to Australia or air freight to Chile, you got to go through Pearson and you got to change planes,
Right.
and you got to have a big enough plane in Thunder Bay to get it onto
Right,
to get it down to Pearson, right? You know, so that's an issue, but it's a lot smaller than the container issue, right?
Okay.
But
Thank you very much for coming in. Lots of great information. It sounds like you're working hard and you're on the issues, so that's great. So thank you very much,
Take care.
and thank you for listening.